Welcome back to the Commodities Institute podcast. I'm Emily Costa, and today is Friday, March 27th, 2026. There are moments in global commodities when everything feels connected: energy, metals, agriculture, even power systems. And this week is one of those moments. What we're seeing right now is not just another price cycle. It's a structural shock driven by geopolitics that is rippling through nearly every major commodity market. Let's start by setting the stage. The ongoing conflict involving Iran has effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery through which roughly 1/5 of global oil and gas flows. That single disruption has pushed oil prices above $100 per barrel and triggered a cascade of consequences across the global economy. Now, what's fascinating is the divergences in narratives. On one side, US officials are projecting calm, emphasizing resilience and even framing higher prices as a signal for increased production. On the other side, global energy executives are warning of something much more severe, a supply crisis that could outlast the conflict itself. And that difference matters. Because while the United States may be insulated from immediate shortages, much of the world is not. Across Asia, governments are already implementing emergency measures. Some countries are considering work-from-home mandates again, reminiscent of the pandemic era, simply to conserve fuel. The Philippines, for example, has declared a state of emergency with just 45 days of oil supply remaining. In Europe, the concern is more forward-looking, but no less serious. Executives are warning that shortages could begin to bite as early as next month. And here's the key point. This isn't just about the flow of oil. It's about infrastructure damage. Refineries, liquefied natural gas facilities, export terminals, many have been hit. Even when the conflict ends, restarting that infrastructure could take months. So what does that mean for prices? Well, in the short term, higher prices are doing exactly what markets are designed to do, sending signals. But the response isn't immediate. US shale producers, for instance, are not rushing to ramp up output. They need sustained high prices, not a temporary spike before committing capital. And most of their spending plans for this year are already locked in, so supply remains constrained. Meanwhile, demand destruction hasn't fully kicked in yet. That's the uncomfortable middle ground we're in right now. Tight supply, resilient demand, and rising prices. Now let's talk about who benefits. Because in every disruption, there are winners. For the major oil companies, this is shaping up to be an extraordinary quarter. Brent crude has averaged close to $97 per barrel this month, up dramatically from earlier in the year. For companies producing millions of barrels per day, that translates into billions in additional revenue. Some estimates suggest that a single month of elevated prices could add roughly $4 to $5 billion in revenue for the largest producers. But here's the nuance. These windfalls are not necessarily translating into increased investment. Executives are cautious. They've seen this before. Prices spike, then fall. And long-term projects require confidence over 5 to 7 years, not just a few volatile months. So instead of a supply response, we're seeing a financial response: higher profits, stronger balance sheets, and likely shareholder returns. Now let's shift gears to agriculture, because energy shocks don't stay confined to energy. One of the clearest transmission mechanisms is fertilizer. Fertilizer production is heavily dependent on natural gas, and as gas prices rise, so do fertilizer costs. In Ukraine, for example, urea prices have surged by more than 60% since the start of the year. For now, farmers are largely insulated because they stocked up earlier. Planting decisions for this season are already set. But looking ahead, the picture changes. If high fertilizer prices persist, farmers may shift away from crops like corn, which are more fertilizer intensive. That could start as early as 2027, potentially reshaping global grain supply. At the same time, we're seeing shifts in Brazil, the world's largest sugar exporter. High energy prices are encouraging mills to divert sugarcane toward ethanol production instead of sugar. As a result, sugar exports are expected to fall by more than 14% in the upcoming season. This is a classic example of how interconnected these markets are. Energy prices influence biofuel economics, which in turn affect agricultural output and global trade flows. Now, let's move into metals, where the story is again one of supply disruption. Aluminum premiums in Japan have surged to their highest level in 11 years. Why? Because the Middle East accounts for a significant share of global aluminum production, and shipments through the Strait of Hormuz have effectively stalled. Buyers are paying sharply higher premiums just to secure supply, and there's a real concern that production itself could be impacted if raw materials can't reach smelters. At the same time, countries like India are scrambling to secure raw materials for steel production. They're looking to diversify supply chains, seeking iron ore, coking coal, and even critical minerals like lithium from new partners. This is a broader theme we're seeing across commodities. Diversification. Countries and companies are rethinking supply chains, not just for efficiency, but for resilience. And that brings us to carbon and power, where this crisis may have one of its most lasting impacts. There's a growing realization that energy security and energy transition are no longer separate conversations. They're converging. Renewable energy, wind, solar, batteries is increasingly being viewed not just as a climate solution, but as a security solution. Unlike oil and gas, which depend on global trade routes, renewables can be produced locally, and that's powerful. Executives are now saying that this crisis could accelerate the transition to renewables, not because of environmental policy, but because of economic and strategic necessity. At the same time, there are challenges closer to home. In the United States, the power grid is under strain, particularly from the rapid growth of data centers. These facilities are incredibly energy intensive, and their demand is expected to more than quadruple by the end of the decade. That's forcing a shift in how power is managed. For the first time, data centers are being asked to reduce consumption during peak demand periods, a concept known as demand response. It's a significant change for an industry that has traditionally required constant, uninterrupted power. And while it's still early days, this flexibility could become a critical tool in balancing the grid and avoiding costly infrastructure expansion. Finally, let's touch briefly on dry freight and grains. The European Union is forecasting a smaller wheat crop in the coming season, while exports are expected to increase. At the same time, major importers like Algeria are continuing to secure large volumes of wheat through international tenders. These flows matter because they reflect underlying demand stability, even as supply conditions fluctuate. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what do you see? You see a global commodities system under stress, but also adapting. Energy markets are tightening, but also signaling for change. Agricultural markets are adjusting to cost pressures. Metals markets are reflecting supply chain fragility, and power systems are evolving in real time. This is what a systemic shock looks like. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: these effects don't end when the conflict ends. Infrastructure damage, investment decisions, behavioral changes, these all have longer timelines. So the story we're following today is not just about a crisis, it's about a transition toward a more diversified, more resilient, and perhaps more localized global commodities system. That's all for today's episode. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review.